Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Only Angela Blackwell could get people up at 7 a.m. after a Janelle Monáe concert last night.
In August, PolicyLink, the organization I founded, held its 7th National Equity Summit in Atlanta, a fabulous gathering of 2,000 activists, equity leaders, democracy champions, artists, and visionaries. In addition to all the work that got done, there was gorgeous visual art everywhere, a Morehouse marching band, and a concert featuring Janelle Monáe that had us dancing late into the night. Early the following morning, I moderated a panel about reimagining democracy for a good life and how we can make that vision a reality. Today, we bring that conversation to you at a time when our country is reevaluating what it means to be a multiracial, pluralist society. I'm Angela Glover Blackwell, and this is our Season 1 bonus episode, Solidarity is Hard. For years, I've been thinking deeply about the possibilities of a thriving multiracial democracy and how our nation has never delivered on the full promise of democracy. Right now, in the wake of the 2024 election, the possibility may seem more elusive than ever. But that doesn't dash my hope. It just quickens my sense of urgency. As I said in Chapter 6 of this podcast series, hope is a discipline. And one thing that helps me live that discipline is seeing leaders, activists, and organizers all across the country working, even in the face of furious headwinds, to build a radically inclusive democracy in service of human flourishing. If you listen to the whole series, you know that one place where that work has taken hold is Los Angeles. We explored how some of the darkest moments in its history inspired multiracial organizing and a robust movement to create a just, fair, thriving city for all. We saw how a labor community coalition emerged, built power, and used it to expand opportunities for working people, especially those of color, who have been kept behind for so long. And we saw how grassroots power led to the election of the city's first Black woman mayor, Karen Bass, a native of South LA, and a community organizing veteran who has centered her governing agenda not on special interests, but on the needs of people. What's going on in LA is an unfolding story, but it's an important one for the nation at this moment. A couple of key people who are part of what's happening in Los Angeles joined us in August at the Equity Summit in Atlanta. Kent Wong, who you heard at the top of this episode, has been in the labor movement for decades. He's the former director of the UCLA Labor Center and is now project director of labor community partnerships there. He is also the founding president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, and he was a guest earlier this season. We also had with us...
All right, good morning. My name is Alberto Retana, President and CEO of Community Coalition.
Community Coalition is a South Los Angeles nonprofit dedicated to empowering residents to transform their communities, improve education, and redefine public safety. As you may recall, that organization was founded by Mayor Karen Bass. Both she and Alberto also appeared in previous episodes this season. Also on the panel was someone who's doing great work in Georgia, Holley.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Atlanta.
Hillary is a Georgia native who helped launch Stacey Abrams' first gubernatorial campaign and founded Fair Fight Action, a Georgia-based nonprofit focusing on raising awareness about election reform, advocating for change, and providing vital voter education to strengthen democracy. She is also the senior director of civic engagement at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. A quick reminder, this conversation was recorded nearly 3 months before the 2024 election. Wong is the person who I learned from about labor, who I learned from about what labor's been, what labor needs to be, and how labor and labor community organizing really is how we're able to breathe life into this notion of a thriving multiracial democracy in service of human flourishing. So Kent, just talk about that. Talk about that history, both in terms of how you see the importance of labor and labor in LA.
40 years ago, a group of Los Angeles radicals, revolutionaries, very inexperienced, a little arrogant group of folks got together, and we approached the pastor of Holman United Methodist Church, a man by the name of Reverend James Lawson Jr., who passed away in June of this year at the age of 95. And a group of us approached Reverend Lawson because we wanted to learn the lessons from the freedom struggles of the South, that we wanted to see how we could apply some of those lessons to growing movement in Los Angeles. And so for years, a small group of us, another network, as Angela referenced, of about 10 or 12 of us got together and we learned from Reverend Lawson. We learned about the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968. We learned about the freedom rides and the freedom struggles and the sit-in campaigns. We learned about nonviolence. And as part of our education, we also did political size-up and political analysis, and we tried to use this way of interpreting the world to apply to our work. And this was transformational for every single one of us in that room. And although there were only 12 of us, one was our now mayor, Karen Bass, who became the first woman and first woman of color to ever lead the city of Los Angeles. One was Antonio Villaraigosa, who was the first Latino mayor of Los Angeles in 130 years. One was Senator Maria Elena Durazo, who was the first woman to ever lead the 800,000-member Los Angeles County Federation of Labor. So this small group of people that learned from Reverend Lawson 40 years ago were trying to apply lessons from other parts of the country and other movements to what we could do and what we could grow in Los Angeles. And from its very inception, we understood the necessity of multiracial organizing, that no movement in Los Angeles is going to be successful unless we are grounded in deep solidarity among communities of color and in growing labor community alliances. And so a few of us from the Holman Group were just getting started in the labor movement with this crazy aspiration and dream of building a progressive labor movement in the midst of this deeply entrenched white racist labor movement of Los Angeles that had excluded black people for generations from the building trades, that had embraced anti-immigrant policies, refused to translate meetings, refused to translate contracts into Spanish. And together, we worked to transform Los Angeles social movements, drawing from experiences from other parts of the country, drawing from the lessons of the United Farm Workers and the lessons of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and applying these movements to what we could do in Los Angeles. And so I was so excited when Angela approached me about this project because I don't think LA is exceptional. I don't think LA is unique. And I think the lessons in movement building in Los Angeles are drawn from movement building across the country. And some of the lessons from Los Angeles can be applied to movement building in other parts of the country. And principally, that is to challenge the ugly, racist, sexist past of the US labor movement and to build a progressive democratic labor movement that centers our work on working class multiracial unity. So I think this podcast on Los Angeles has deep implications and applications for movement building across the country, and I am deeply grateful for your work in pulling this together.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you. I want you to say a little more while you have the floor, though. because I want you to talk about some of the moments that have been particularly important as labor and community have found each other in LA.
That's great. So, two path-breaking organizing campaigns in Los Angeles that pace-set the rest of the labor movement and showed this could be done was the hotel workers led by Maria Elena Durazo with direct engagement from Reverend James Lawson Jr., that Reverend Lawson was brought in to train her leaders, her staff, her members about the power of nonviolence. And the hotel workers started doing things that had never been done in the Los Angeles labor movement, including disruption and civil disobedience and taking over downtown intersections in Los Angeles during rush hour to lift up the contributions of hotel workers in Los Angeles. The second breakthrough campaign was the Justice for Janitors campaign, led by my union. On June 15, 1990, dozens of peacefully protesting janitors trained in nonviolence by Reverend Lawson were beaten by the LAPD. Dozens were sent to the hospital. One woman suffered a miscarriage. And dozens more were jailed. And as a consequence of that, our union won a multi-million-dollar settlement for the vicious attack by the LAPD. And more importantly, it attracted national attention to the movement of the Justice for Janitors, and we successfully reorganized the janitorial industry that went from 10% union density to 90% union density in the course of that campaign. Following the victory of the Justice for Janitors, the next campaign that, once again, Reverend Lawson helped to launch was to organize the base of predominantly Latino immigrant janitors to organize the predominantly African-American security officers who are working for the same multinational corporations. And so it was through that campaign that Reverend Lawson called out plantation capitalism. He called out the very nature of a US-style capitalism grounded in racial oppression and anti-blackness. And so this was powerful for a majority Latino union to allocate time, energy, and resources to organize one of the largest African-American organizing campaigns that California had seen. And thousands of security officers were brought into that union. And to this day, we have union meetings where you have African-American workers sitting side by side Latino immigrant workers. They do not speak the same language, but they know the language of justice.
Thank you. Alberto, as the leader of the Community Coalition, you have really seen firsthand how communities and labor and community members who are clearly working hard, trying to make a way for their families, have had to really struggle to do that. And being able to pull together and have greater voice and impact has really been what Community Coalition has been about. Talk about that and how it's really developed and how this happens to be related to Karen.
First of all, we are blessed to have Kent Wong in Los Angeles. One of the interesting dynamics I think that we'll come to in a few, hopefully, is you were confronting people in power who were outright working to shut you down. Now those very people that were working to shut people down are in power. And so we're trying to figure out in Los Angeles, what does governing power look like? And then we have a younger generation of folks born through a generation of just activism, from Trayvon's murder and assassination to today, where we've had the Occupy movement, the BLM movement, the climate movement, from the Seattle protests all the way through the summer of 2020. And an interesting generation of folks in my group that are somewhat like a mediating force between the young, hungry freedom dreamers, those that were dreaming before who are now in power. And so what does it look like to build power, bring about victory, not do away with the appetite for street mobilizations and disruptions, but also win some shit? I mean, it's part of this podcast, Angela, which has allowed us to really be reflective of this. How do we make sure that we have these conversations taking place so that we can inspire the multi-generational alliance that's needed in this next period? A lot of lessons learned, and help folks kind of wrestle with governance and change. So I just wanted to put that out there. What can I say about our work? Look, at Community Coalition, we are absolutely committed to organizing Black and brown solidarity every single day. Not at the expense of API solidarity and white solidarity, indigenous solidarity. The reason we work with Black and brown folks in particular is because that's the nature of the community in which I reside in and work in South Central Los Angeles, a community who's shifted over the past 30 years, a community that was once 2/3 African American, 1/3 Black, is now 2/3 Latino, 1/3 Black. We still live next to each other. We still ride the same buses. We still go to the same schools. We're still facing injustice in uniquely different ways and similar ways. And so we fight every day to organize them, and that's just not the norm, hasn't been the norm. And more of that has changed over the last 5-10 years, but that's not always been the case, and it continues to not always be the case. It's much easier to organize in your own community than it is to organize across community. It's much easier to organize in your own neighborhood than to organize across neighborhoods. It's much easier to organize, as difficult as it is to organize in our own communities, in your own sector, than it is across sectors. And at Community Coalition, we've rejected that notion from day one when the organization was started by Mayor Karen Bass. It was to confront the crack epidemic impacting Los Angeles and across the country. And South Central was an area that was deeply impacted by the crack cocaine crisis and acutely impacting the Black community. When she opened the doors of Community Coalition, she just didn't open up an organization that was going to organize the Black community. She said, no, we're going to organize Latino folks as well. And that wasn't popular. It wasn't popular to take federal money to start this organization. It wasn't popular for her to organize Black and brown folks together to do this work. It wasn't popular for her to organize folks that were doing recovery. It wasn't popular for her to say, hey, we're not going to have alcohol at our events because we have people in recovery. These were unpopular things at the time, but were the very genesis and the DNA of Community Coalition. So here we are 30 years later doing the same thing. There is certainly, I believe, a commitment by the organization to continue to fight for the freedom to play, the freedom to work a good job, to shop, to eat, to move in your neighborhood without fear of violence, without fear of death, without fear of exploitation, without fear of exclusion. And that very fight for freedom is what we do to unite our Black and brown folks. It's not easy, right? I don't know if anyone here is from Chicago, but for my friends in Chicago, some of the challenges that creating in division by sending folks undocumented into Chicago and the Mayor Johnson progressively stepping up to say, hey, we're going to support these immigrants, and Black folks in the community wondering, where's my support? There's division that's being bred. And that's the work of organizers, is to sort of help separate out the noise and help folks remind folks of who the real enemy is. Those dynamics still exist in Los Angeles around Black and brown jobs, and folks getting caught up and forgetting that there's one group of folks being excluded from the workforce and another group exploited from the workforce that should be fighting together for the same pie. But if no one is raising those questions, it's easy for us to fall into our camps and organize against each other. One of the things that the mayor, when she worked at Community Coalition, really tried to train us in is to never be surprised by division. Never be surprised by division, because division is already ripe and built into the system. So don't be shocked if someone says something anti-Black or anti-brown. That's the norm. That's what America trains us to be. So don't deny it. Let's talk about why, what's happening. To say that Latinos are not working construction and you don't see Black folks working the sites, we're not going to deny that. Of course that's happening. What are we going to do about that, right? And so she's really helped us to not react to division, but to confront it and to have the conversations.
Thank you so much. What Karen is leading is governing for human flourishing. That's how that translates. That reason that you want to be able to have people who come from community get into these positions is so they can begin to move the apparatus that is supposed to be helping people live whatever they define as a good life to be able to get there. And I have just been so impressed. It really is quite inspiring. Hillary, the reason that I wanted you to join is because I believe what Kent said. I think that what is going on in Los Angeles is happening in different ways in communities all across this country. We watch the conventions, the national conventions, and that's when we talk about democracy and we think about the days that we go out and vote. But democracy really is communities being able to understand that they are the leaders of the future, that they are the ones who are going to bring the passion and the determination that comes from lives that are both joyful and struggling, and how to bring that joy that comes with the aspiration of what you want and the reality of that struggle to really understand what the path has to be to get there. And so I actually think that what you've been doing really begins to mirror what's happening, but has its own twist. And so could you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. Going into 2020, we knew that some wild stuff was going to happen in the state of Georgia. So during the runoff, the majority of the canvassers in Georgia actually come from organized labor. Unite Here, the Teamsters, SEIU, AFL-CIO, they were the ones who were canvassing but also doing voter protection work. And so in 2020, we had thousands of provisional ballots, meaning something's wrong with your registration, so instead of rejecting you, I gotta give you a provisional, but you have to come back within 3 days and fix it or your vote won't count. The people who were going to cure provisional ballots were the labor organizers, were the workers. Actually, during the insurrection, I get a call from Gwen Mills, who is now the president of Unite Here. And I'm thinking she's gonna talk to me about the insurrection. Her first question was, do I still need to have the workers out curing absentee ballots? I was just like, no, but it just really stuck with me. And that's what actually then brought me into labor organizing at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And it was there where I actually learned, y'all, 10 minutes down the street is actually one of the first worker strikes post-slavery. It was the Atlanta washerwomen strike of 1881. And talk about racism in labor unions. Their strike helped create a movement that then went to the North and went to the West. But when it came to passing the Fair Labor and Standards Act, who got excluded? The domestic workers, who were supposed to work for free, taking care of everyone's kids, washing everyone's clothes, they got excluded. Disabled workers and farm workers. And people like to think it was the segregationist who threw everyone under the bus. It was actually the labor unions who struck that deal. And then it brought me to, in Georgia, like I was just telling you the story, that without worker organizing, we could not have done the unimaginable in mitigating voter suppression so much that we actually had a chance to elect the first Black U.S. Senator and the first Jewish senator from the state of Georgia. And so I really believe that we have something going here. We have a lot of wins. Like right when I met these two, I was like, let me tell you about the wins. Waffle House workers, right? In South Carolina and Georgia just got an increased salaried wage. Y'all, they're not dues paying members. These are just pissed off people. And we are this close to getting them a $16 wage. That's huge. The Teamsters work, when they were going up against UPS is headquartered in Atlanta, y'all. And so there is a movement growing. And I really think that this solidarity of folks on each coast is very beautiful. And I think that if this continues, we are gonna get to really have multiracial governance. And I am learning from you and you about when Southern folks get leaders who are doing this now elected, how are we gonna be prepared for that governing moment?
Whew. You all have really made the point of radically inclusive, thriving, multiracial democracy in service of human flourishing. And I know that people think that the places that we're talking about, Georgia and LA, are full of problems. And I even worry as we put the podcast out there that it is so important for people to know that what we're trying to do is lift up the possibilities by lifting up what people are doing in local communities. That's where change happens. That's where it always happens. People in local communities who are authentically working for change together are the ones who can see a future that people working at the national level often cannot see. It's not that they don't want to see it, but they don't see it because they're just not right there, and that we don't pay enough attention. And democracy is the place where we really need to be leaning into that idea, because this is democracy, and this is how you get democracy for human flourishing. But it is hard. There are a lot of problems. So I'd like for each of you to talk about what's hard about it. What's hard about it, and how do you see a way through the hard stuff? I'll start with you, Ken.
Clearly, Los Angeles has a lot of problems, has a lot of challenges, has a lot of issues. And although we have dedicated our lives to build and promote working class solidarity, multiracial unity, to envision a multiracial democracy, we have forces moving the other way every day to promote racial divisions, to promote anti-blackness, to promote anti-immigrant sentiment in order to divide the working class. What I am so proud, because that's the challenge, but I want to end it on a high note. What I am so proud of is that the LA labor movement elected by unanimous vote the first black woman to ever lead the 800,000 member LA labor movement, Yvonne Wheeler. And that even in this dark hour, a predominantly Latino immigrant working class base turned out resoundingly to support Karen Bass for mayor. And she won after being outspent 13-1. So that's a victory. When Yvonne Wheeler assumed leadership of this labor movement at a very challenging time with these deep racial divisions, she asked me to facilitate the very first retreat to reconsolidate, to rebuild, to pull together the LA labor movement for a vision for the future. And so right after she had assumed leadership, we did a retreat, and we spent the weekend together to really walk through, to talk about the necessity of building multiracial unity, to talk about anti-blackness within the labor movement, to talk about ways that we can build in a way around a vision for the future. And I was so proud of the LA County Federation of Labor, because by the end of that weekend, they said, we are going to throw down to support Karen Bass and her campaign against homelessness in Los Angeles. And why is it that so many are people of color? Why is it we have so many African-American unhoused people in Los Angeles? It is because of the legacy of slavery, mass incarceration, and disinvestment in black communities. So this was the vision that we emerged from within the LA County Federation of Labor to work with Karen Bass and to secure policies that will tax the rich and that will fund affordable housing. So yes, the racial divisions exist. We cannot pretend they do not. The anti-immigrant, the anti-blackness is being promoted daily. We cannot pretend that does not exist. And yet, we have to forge labor and community alliances to build power for working class communities. And if there's one thing that I will leave you with, I think that we need to forge much more bold and aggressive labor community alliances and partnerships at a local, statewide, regional, and national level.
I would be remiss as a Georgian in a room full of folks from California. We love y'all here. But y'all, black and brown people exist across this entire state. I want folks in California to remember that there are people who have the same beliefs as you all across this state. I remember in 2020, when everyone and their mama wanted to help during the runoffs, some of the stuff that West Coast folks were saying to Georgia voters was wild. The one big problem that I will say I have here, solidarity is hard. Maurice Mitchell likes to say solidarity is never easy, it's actually meant to be hard. And it in fact is. So I think it is learning how to have solidarity from the West and the South, and how we can really work together here to make sure that the way that we organize in the South, it can be very different. And it's that learning and that hearing that I think is really going to help Georgia and the South have these wins that have really yet come to fruition for the rest of the country.
Wow. I really appreciate your honesty in the way that you brought these issues. I mean, we can't get so excited by the positives that we don't absolutely understand what we have to overcome. And the stories indicate that we can overcome it, but it takes work. And you can't do the right work if you don't really understand the issues. I really appreciate that. Alberto.
The forces that we are up against are absolutely significant. Unity is a really easy word to say, but what folks oftentimes forget about the word unity is that in order for unity to exist, so does difference. Unity doesn't exist without difference. It's built into it. And so unity and struggle is the process by which we've embraced in thinking about building solidarity. In order to have unity, you need to struggle with people who you might not always be with to be unified so that you can struggle against those forces. We cannot allow individuals in elected office to get in the way of the assemblies we need to build on the ground. We don't have to wait for the state to build democracy when we can build democracy in the workplace through our labor unions and in our neighborhoods through community organizing.
Our solidarity is a critical source of strength. Listening back to this conversation reinforces that especially when times are bleak, solidarity is hard, but it is essential. And when we get it right, it propels our movement for democracy in service of human flourishing. This conversation also lifts up two things that I'm holding close after an election that will test democracy in ways we've never seen. First, the importance of labor community partnerships as we chart our path forward. Labor unions have an ugly history when it comes to race and inclusion, but a profound shift is underway. In LA and Georgia and many other places, communities are recognizing that organized labor is essential for building an economy and a democracy that works for all of us. And the labor movement is being reshaped by people of color, fighting for the needs of a multiracial workforce. The second thing this conversation highlights is that the best stuff, the most vigorous organizing, the most creative solutions, the boldest leadership always happens close to the ground, and it's informed by the people who live there. I think of local communities as lighthouses for the nation, shining their beam, showing us where we can land when the waters are calm or the seas roil in darkness. I will continue to bring you stories of these beacons of change. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to Season 1 of Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life, I hope you'll check it out. And I hope you'll join me for Season 2 as we continue to lift up communities across the nation, translating solidarity into political power. There's more to come because there's more out there. Reimagining Democracy for a Good Life is a podcast created by PolicyLink in partnership with Pineapple Street Studios. We are grateful for the PolicyLink funders whose support allows us to produce this show. For a transcript of the episodes and for more resources, visit policylink.org. The team at PolicyLink is Perfecta Oxholm, Fran Smith, Glenda Johnson, Josh Kirschenbaum, Virgil Ramos, Venice Dunn, Montana Rain, and Lauren Madden. Special thanks to PolicyLink CEO Michael McAfee. This episode was produced by Yinka Rickford Anglin, with support from associate producer Lisa Serta. Camila Kashani is our managing producer. Our editor is Darby Maloney. Fact-checking by Jonathan Menjivar. Our senior audio engineer and mixer is Pedro Alvira. theme song by Donwell, and our music by Epidemic Sound. Our head of sound and engineering is Raj Makajan. J.N. Barry is our executive producer. I'm your host, Angela Glover Black.